August 1st, 1944. Brittany, France. The sun hammered down on the hedgerow country. German Army Group B, under Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, felt the pressure, but they didn't feel the threat. They had been bloodied in the static hell of the Normandy bocage, but their analysts, veteran strategists whose entire lives had been steeped in the mathematics of warfare, offered a clear consensus. The American offensive, which had just exploded south and west of St. Lo in Operation Cobra, was a temporary convulsion, a spectacular but ultimately limited breakthrough. General Feldmarschall Kluge, assessing the damage to his 7th Army, relied on the cold calculus of logistics. His staff officers, well versed in the logistical nightmares that had strangled every previous large-scale Allied operation, simply scoffed at the maps. They saw the speed of the American advance, led by General George S. Patton's newly activated Third Army. But they also saw the distance. Their intelligence painted a picture of a shattered French rail network and a few captured shallow ports. They knew the rules of war and the tyranny of distance. A modern mechanized army, a Blitzkrieg army, had an Achilles heel: fuel and ammunition. "Let them advance," one staff officer reportedly remarked. "They carry their defeat with them." The German High Command was united in this fatal assessment. They knew that a single American armored division consumed, on average, 600 tons of supplies every day. They knew that an army group on the move, pushing a front hundreds of miles wide, required an almost unimaginable flow, a river of steel and oil. The distance from the nearest major supply hub, the man-made Mulberry harbors and the rudimentary staging areas on the Normandy beaches, to Patton's spearheads was now over 350 miles. The numbers didn't lie, or so they believed. A standard World War II truck convoy could move only so far before the trucks themselves drained the bulk of the fuel they were carrying. The friction of the movement, maintenance, traffic jams, enemy interdiction, driver fatigue, always ground the tempo of the advance to a halt. The German generals had mastered Blitzkrieg, but they had also mastered the chase. They believed the enemy, outrunning their supply lines, would simply stall out, stranded like beached whales, vulnerable to counterattack. They laughed, a dangerous, arrogant, and ultimately fatal laughter. They underestimated not the American soldier, but the American industrial and organizational muscle. They underestimated the sheer, terrifying scale of American logistics, the logistical tale that would soon become the most significant and least celebrated force multiplier of the Western campaign. George Patton, a general obsessed with speed and contemptuous of caution, understood the German mindset perfectly. He knew that their historical bias would lead them to predict his halt. That was his greatest advantage. He wanted to achieve what no army in history had done at this speed: unbroken momentum. Patton's Third Army, the phantom formation that Hitler and his generals had feared was poised to strike at the Pas de Calais, was now unleashed. Its divisions were a mix of hardened veterans and aggressive newcomers. They didn't march, they drove. The 4th Armored Division, the name-brand division under Major General John S. Wood, sliced through the soft German underbelly, breaking the enemy's operational coherence. Wood's motto became the spirit of the entire advance: "Go until you are stopped, and then go some more." The objective wasn't just territory, it was strategic paralysis. Patton aimed to shatter the German defensive line, turn north and east, and trap the entirety of Army Group B against the Seine River. The plan was brilliant, and its execution was swift and brutal. But as August wore on, the German prediction began to look eerily correct. By mid-month, Patton's tanks were consuming fuel at an astronomical rate. The 4th Armored alone was gobbling down 300,000 gallons of gasoline a day. The advance had become a victim of its own success. The logistical reality was a crisis of monumental proportions. The few operational ports, like Cherbourg, were still being cleared of German sabotage. The main supply line still snaked back over the crowded invasion beaches. "My men can eat their belts," Patton reportedly snapped to his logistics staff, "but my tanks gotta have gas." The crisis required a radical, unprecedented solution. It wasn't about more trucks. It was about a system. The solution was born from the brain of Colonel Clarence L. Red Burpee of the Transportation Corps, operating out of the massive supply center at Rennes. His concept was simple in its core and terrifying in its execution. A one-way, high-speed, military-exclusive supply highway, running day and night, dedicated solely to moving supplies from the depots in Normandy to the front lines near Le Mans, and eventually to Paris and beyond. They called it the Red Ball Express. The name itself was borrowed from American rail terminology, a reference to a train or car routed for priority and uninterrupted movement. The Red Ball Express officially opened on August 25, 1944, just as Patton's forces were approaching the Seine. The route was a vast 700-mile loop stretching from Saint-Lô and Cherbourg to the forward depots, a constant circuit of movement. Crucially, it was a one-way road. Two parallel routes, marked with distinctive red ball signs, were established. The northern route carried the supplies east, and the southern route brought the empty trucks west back to the ports. This eliminated all opposing traffic and allowed for non-stop, maximum speed movement. But a highway is only as good as the drivers and the trucks. To staff this massive, non-stop operation, the U.S. Army threw everything it had into the breach. The backbone of the Red Ball Express was the ubiquitous GMCC CKW 2.5-ton 6x6 truck, the Deuce and a Half. These trucks, manufactured in the tens of thousands, were reliable but not tireless. They had to be driven to the point of collapse. The drivers, the forgotten heroes of the logistical war, were drawn from every corner of the Allied forces, but the vast majority were African-American soldiers from quartermaster truck companies. Segregation in the U.S. Army relegated most black troops to service and support roles. While they were denied combat opportunities by a racially biased command structure, they were given the task that would ultimately determine the campaign's success. These men, tired, overworked, and operating under a constant state of acute danger, drove 24 hours a day through the heat of the day and the pitch black of the French countryside. They were not combat troops, but they became combat essential. They faced exhaustion, the ever-present threat of German Luftwaffe strafing runs, and the occasional German Wehrmacht straggler ambushes from the dense forests. One such driver was Private First Class James Bubba Washington, a 20-year-old from Atlanta attached to the 3918 Quartermaster Truck Company. Washington's convoy would leave the Cherbourg depot loaded high with 5-gallon jerrycans of gasoline, stacked to the sky, transforming his truck into a rolling fuel-air bomb. "You drove until you couldn't see," Washington recalled in his later years. "Your eyes felt like sand. You drove until the fella riding shotgun had to slap you to keep you on the road. And then the sun came up, and you saw the gas cans stacked behind you, and you knew if a tracer round hit that load, you were gone." The schedule was brutal. Drivers often pulled 36-hour shifts with only brief breaks for a meager meal and a check of the tires. Speed limits were enforced, but they were high, and convoys were meant to move in packs, nose to tail, as fast as the lead truck dared to push the road. The sheer volume was staggering. At its peak, the Red Ball Express employed 5,958 vehicles and 23,000 men, a full Army Corps of truck drivers, mechanics, and dispatchers. The German High Command, still anticipating the American collapse, watched their intelligence maps with rising confusion. Patton's tanks should have stopped. The supply lines should have frayed and broken. Yet the advance didn't merely continue, it accelerated. Major General Harm Hasso von Manteuffel, a veteran Panzer commander, found himself fighting American units that appeared to be impossibly well provisioned. The fuel gauge on their tanks, the ammunition boxes in their fighting positions, everything pointed to an unbroken supply chain, a logistical miracle that defied everything he and his peers had learned about mechanized warfare. The laughter began to die in the operations rooms of Army Group B, replaced by a cold, stomach-churning fear. What they could not see was the relentless, gritty work being done out on the roads. the endless stream of deuce and a halves, carrying the lifeblood of the offensive. The Red Ball Express, a simple organizational tool, was having a profound strategic effect. It removed the logistical check on Patton's audacity. It allowed the American general to operate at the speed of blitzkrieg, without the customary requirement to pause for rest and resupply. The numbers the German generals had used to dismiss the offensive now mocked them. In the first 81 days of the Red Ball Express operation, its drivers delivered 412,000 tons of supplies, primarily fuel and ammunition, to the front lines. This wasn't merely a supply run. It was a sustained, overwhelming effort that crushed the German strategic assumptions under a wave of American-made steel. This continuous flow allowed Patton to execute his audacious plan to swing east and north, effectively sealing the Falaise pocket. The Third Army's speed and sustained pressure closed the escape route for dozens of German divisions, leading to the utter destruction of Army Group B. The Wehrmacht lost over 50,000 men captured and nearly 10,000 killed. The sheer momentum that forced this was not driven by tank engines alone, but by the logistics flowing along the Red Ball roads. The Germans, now in full retreat across France, fought desperately to slow the American onslaught. Bridges were systematically blown. Fuel and supply dumps were targeted by sporadic but often deadly air attacks. The Red Ball drivers were now not just moving supplies, they were a critical infrastructure, and thus a priority target. The route itself became a landscape of brutal accidents and mechanical carnage. The high speeds, the lack of sleep, and the sheer volume of traffic meant that a single lapse in concentration could result in a catastrophic pile-up. The maintenance teams worked frantically to keep the aging trucks running. For every 10 trucks on the road, at least 2 were in the repair shops, awaiting parts or major engine work. The drivers' lives were a blur of the road, the rhythmic rumble of the 6 wheels, and the smell of high-octane gasoline. Their mission was so singular, so relentless, that the war around them often faded into a distant threat, until it didn't. On a moonless night in early September, near a small French village whose name no one remembers, a Red Ball convoy hauling artillery shells came under fire. German stragglers, desperate and cornered, had set up an impromptu ambush. Sergeant Marcus "Mac" O'Brien, a white driver from New York who found himself alongside the segregated quartermaster units, had his truck slammed to a halt by a burst of machine gun fire that shredded his radiator. O'Brien and his assistant driver, Private First Class Thomas T.J. Jones, a young black man from Philadelphia, were service troops, not infantry. Their weapons were their trucks and their sidearms, yet they instantly became front-line soldiers. While Jones scrambled to grab a rifle, O'Brien used the bulky shell-filled truck as cover, returning fire at the indistinct muzzle flashes from the tree line. The attack lasted only minutes before the Germans melted away, but the message was clear. The logistics column was a combat zone. The reality was that the Red Ball Express was never fully protected by dedicated combat troops. The infantry and armor were already at the limit of their advance, using the supplies the Red Ball was delivering. The convoys relied on their sheer volume and the sporadic efforts of military police to keep the route open. The drivers, regardless of color or background, were forced to develop a hardened frontier mentality. They knew that if they stopped, the whole offensive stopped. If the Third Army ran out of gas, the entire strategic advantage gained by the Normandy breakout would evaporate. Patton understood this. He didn't send a personal thank you letter to the Red Ball drivers. He sent a clear order to the logistical command. Keep it flowing, or I will personally hold you responsible. This pressure, this relentless demand for speed, drove the men to unimaginable feats of endurance. The speed of the advance created an entirely new set of problems, the lack of secure, pre-positioned depots. The trucks weren't just driving hundreds of miles, they were driving into the unknown, chasing a rapidly moving front. The tail of the supply chain was continuously trying to catch the teeth of the fighting force. This led to the creation of Advance Section, ADSEC, logistical bases, constantly leapfrogging the original supply dumps. The Quartermaster Corps became masters of setting up functional, forward supply areas in a matter of hours, often in open fields or abandoned factory yards. The system wasn't just about fuel, though that was paramount. It was about everything. K-rations, medical supplies, replacement tires, artillery shells. The Red Ball Express carried the entire vast inventory of the American war machine. As the front moved into eastern France, toward the German border, the loads shifted. The long, continuous high-speed dash required a special kind of cargo. 5-gallon jerry cans stacked high. The jerrycan, a simple piece of pressed steel, became the most important piece of equipment in the European theatre. Its design, originally German, was superior to the flimsy Allied containers. These cans, loaded thousands at a time, were the fluid medium of the American advance. They allowed the quick, decentralized refueling that sustained Patton's momentum. A tank could be refueled directly from dozens of cans without a large, vulnerable tanker truck or a stationary refueling point. But the speed of the advance and the need for any container meant that thousands of cans were simply discarded or lost in the drive. A shocking waste that was deemed a necessary cost of maintaining speed. The motto was simple: keep the front moving, the logistics will catch up. The initial shock of the Red Ball Express wore off as the Germans began to realize the nature of the logistical monster they faced. They couldn't stop it. They could only harass it. German commandos, remnants of shattered units, and the occasional reconnaissance probe tried to disrupt the flow. One German officer, Major Klaus von Ritter, captured near the Rhine, spoke of the growing despair among the Wehrmacht troops. "We were told the Americans had stalled," he recounted during his interrogation. "We were told they were out of gas." Then, day after day, we saw the unending columns, hundreds, sometimes thousands, of trucks, rushing past, heading east. It was not a supply line. It was a river. We realized we were not fighting an army. We were fighting a factory. This strategic realization, the pivot from underestimation to dread, was the true triumph of the Red Ball Express. It didn't win a battle, but it won the battle of tempo. It ensured that the strategic initiative, seized at the breakout from Normandy, was never surrendered. The Red Ball Express's existence highlighted the fundamental imbalance between the Axis and the Allies. Germany, despite its initial genius for blitzkrieg, was fundamentally an army of horses and trains. Even in 1944, the majority of German supplies were moved by rail or drawn by animals. The German High Command could not conceive of an army that could sustain hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies over a vast distance using only motorized transport, a task the Americans made routine. By September 1944, the Red Ball Express had reached its zenith. Its route had stretched to over 800 miles. The drivers were performing miracles, but the cost was high. Trucks were breaking down faster than they could be repaired. The drivers were on the brink of exhaustion. The system was running white-hot, achieving its goal, but nearing its breaking point. The great strategic aim, the crossing of the Seine and the liberation of Paris, had been achieved largely because the logistical lifeline had not failed. Patton's tanks entered Paris on August 25th, the very day the Red Ball Express officially opened, symbolizing the perfect synchronization of the fighting and supply arms. The Third Army, with the Red Ball at its back, pushed on relentlessly toward the German border and the Siegfried Line. The drivers themselves, largely African-American, fought a war on two fronts: the open road against the Germans and the insidious internal struggle against racial prejudice and the segregated military structure. They drove, they maintained, and they were the lifeblood of the offensive, yet they remained second-class citizens in the eyes of the army they served. Their dedication, however, was absolute. They were the anonymous, essential gears in the machine of liberation. By November 1944, the character of the logistical challenge began to shift. The port of Antwerp, an absolutely vital hub, had been captured and was slowly being made operational. The French and Belgian railway systems, though damaged, were being systematically repaired by U.S. Army railway battalions, reducing the reliance on the long-haul trucks. The Typhoid Mary of the logistical crisis, the extreme distance between the Normandy beaches and the front, was being treated. With new, closer supply points opening up, the need for the continuous, frantic, long-distance dash of the Red Ball Express began to diminish. On November 16, 1944, after nearly 3 months of non-stop operation, the Red Ball Express was officially discontinued. Its mission was over. It had successfully supplied the Allied armies during the most critical phase of their advance, buying the time necessary to repair the permanent infrastructure, the ports and the rails that would sustain the final push into Germany. The statistics of the Red Ball Express remain a testament to organizational and human endurance. 89 days of operation, the movement of 412,000 tons of supplies, and the employment of nearly 6,000 trucks and 23,000 men. A crucial detail often overlooked is the 5% loss rate of trucks due to accidents and mechanical failure, a measure of the unsustainable pace the system was forced to maintain. The Red Ball Express was not a single spectacular battle. It was a sustained act of logistical will, the single greatest logistical feat of the European theatre. It allowed General Patton's Third Army to smash through German lines and cover over 1,100 miles of ground in just 44 days, destroying the German capacity to organize a static defense and paving the way for the ultimate collapse of the Western Front. The German generals, who had laughed at the American lack of ports and shattered rail lines, ceased their laughter as their panzer divisions ground to a halt, stranded for lack of fuel. They learned a hard lesson, one that transcended the tactical brilliance of a tank attack. Logistics is the ultimate weapon. It dictates the speed, the depth, and the very possibility of modern warfare. The memory of the men, the drivers, the mechanics, the dispatchers, overwhelmingly African-American soldiers who pushed themselves to the breaking point, remains a powerful symbol of their forgotten contribution to the victory. They were the engine of the offensive. They took the insult of underestimation, both from the enemy abroad and from the segregated command at home, and they transformed it into the fuel that drove the liberation of a continent. 3 months before the Red Ball Express officially opened, the German High Command predicted that the speed of the American advance would ensure its defeat. They believed that an army that outran its supplies had already lost the war. But on August 1, 1944, when Patton's tanks were unleashed, the German generals failed to calculate the speed, the scale, and the relentless grinding organizational power that the American industrial machine could project across an ocean and down a single, red-balled road. The Red Ball Express, a simple organizational trick powered by sheer American logistical might, proved that in the end, it wasn't the tanks that won the Blitz. It was the oil that fueled them. The Red Ball Express, however, was not only a logistical triumph. It was a powerful, if temporary, force for a fragile sense of unity within a deeply segregated fighting force. The men of the quartermaster truck companies, men like Private First Class James Washington and Private First Class Thomas Jones, did not drive for Patton's glory or for the abstract ideal of a free Europe. They drove for each other, for the job, and for the grudging respect earned in the dark hours on the endless road. They were part of a vast, churning labor force that the army had previously seen only as a segregated necessity, relegated to the rear echelon. Suddenly, they were the indispensable vanguard. The white combat troops, the engineers, the tankers, and the artillerymen all understood that their next meal, their next round of shells, and their critical tank fuel came directly from the sweat and the sheer grit of the black drivers who piloted the deuce and a halves through the night. The urgency of the advance trumped the entrenched prejudices of the 1940s. A stalled advance did not care about the color of the driver who failed to deliver the gas. The logistical crisis reached a screaming pitch in early September 1944. As Patton's Third Army turned sharply east, aiming for a rapid crossing of the Moselle River and a potential plunge into the German industrial heartland, the front line stretched into a thin, unsustainable membrane. The distance from the functioning ports was now over 500 miles. Every mile eaten by the advance was a mile added to the logistical burden. But the legacy of the Red Ball Express is clear and undeniable. It fundamentally changed the German perception of American logistical capability. It was the concrete proof that the American military machine could not only outfight the enemy tactically, but could out-resource them strategically, maintaining a velocity of war that the Wehrmacht simply could not comprehend, let alone match. It stands as a testament to the immense power of operational logistics, a silent, grinding, non-stop force that allowed Patton's famous Blitz to become not a temporary dash, but a continuous, unstoppable surge. The German generals laughed at the thought of American motorized supply sustaining such an advance in August 1944. By the time the Red Ball Express was officially deactivated in November 1944, the entire German defense structure had been torn apart by the velocity it sustained. They had laughed at a river that ultimately swept their defenses away. The logistical tail that sustained Patton's push did more than just supply the front. It inadvertently dictated the tempo of the entire Western Front in late 1944. The American capacity to move was so shocking to the German General Staff that it forced them into a series of panicked, premature decisions. They had assumed they had time to reorganize, time to rebuild the shattered divisions, and time to establish the natural defensive line of the Siegfried Line, known to them as the West Wall. The Red Ball Express stole that time, day by relentless day. The Allied High Command, acutely aware of the logistical strain, began a desperate effort to clear and activate the captured port facilities along the English Channel. The primary focus shifted to Le Havre and Rouen, major ports that were essential to reducing the dependency on the ever-fragile Mulberry harbours and the Cherbourg bottleneck. But clearing these heavily damaged, often mined and sabotaged ports was a task that measured in weeks and months, not days. The Red Ball Express had to bridge that gap. The men who drove the route understood their place in this chain, even if the grand strategic implications were abstract. They were tied to the road, their lives measured not in patrols or charges, but in miles driven and gallons delivered. The camaraderie that formed in these segregated companies was intense and unique. They were bonded by shared exhaustion and the common knowledge that their individual skill, or lack thereof, meant life or death for the armoured crews waiting hundreds of miles ahead. The 92nd Infantry Division, an all-black combat unit, remained in Italy. But here, on the supply routes of France, tens of thousands of African-American men were proving themselves utterly indispensable in a supporting role that was secretly the most critical combat role of all. They were not firing rifles at the enemy most days, but they were directly responsible for every artillery shell fired, every plane fueled, and every tank advanced. This was a contribution so significant that it quietly began to erode the ingrained prejudices within the field commands. The commanders at the front needed supplies, and they didn't care who was driving the truck as long as it arrived. One of the great logistical battles of the Red Ball Express was not fought against the Germans, but against wear and tear. The sheer volume of traffic tore up the French roads, and the high speeds destroyed the trucks. The maintenance crisis became a constant looming threat, a logistical shadow war fought by the ordnance and quartermaster mechanics. Sergeant Alistair "Mac" McPherson, a chief mechanic from the 501st Ordnance Heavy Maintenance Company, spent 75 straight days living out of a canvas tent, his hands perpetually stained with oil and gasoline. His company's job was to keep the approximately 6,000 trucks of the Red Ball operational. "We worked until we passed out," McPherson later wrote. "You'd wake up on the floor of the shop, covered in grease, and start turning wrenches again. The worst was the tires. We'd burn through tires faster than they could ship them over from the States. We were constantly patching, retreading, and praying the treads didn't come flying off at 50 miles an hour on a tight curve. The tire shortage became a major overlooked crisis. The rubber on a truck tire driving a 5-ton load over battered roads wore down at an astronomical rate. Every piece of equipment, from the 5-gallon jerry can to the thick rubber tire, was a manufactured commodity that had to cross an ocean and sustain a mechanized war. The Red Ball Express proved that American industry could meet the consumption rate, but only by straining every link in the colossal chain. As the advance pushed deeper, the focus of the supply chain shifted from fuel to ammunition. The battles for the Moselle bridges and the subsequent slogging fights through the forests leading to the Siegfried Line were brutal, costly affairs. The American artillery units, the king of battle, were consuming shells at a fantastic pace. A single division could fire 10,000 rounds of 105mm shells in a day of heavy fighting. These shells, heavy and bulky, required specialized handling and immense transport capacity. The Red Ball Express adjusted. The long columns, once dominated by the highly flammable fuel trucks, now carried massive payloads of explosive artillery rounds. The danger shifted. Instead of exploding in a flash fire from a tracer round, the convoy now risked catastrophic mass detonation from a stray mortar or bomb. The drivers carrying this volatile cargo understood the difference between a fuel truck and an ammunition truck. If a fuel truck was hit, the driver was likely dead. If an ammunition truck was hit, the entire road for 500 yards was likely destroyed. The risk assessment was constant and grim. The supply pressure did not relent until the autumn rains began to turn the French roads into mudslicks. This natural slowdown, combined with the opening of Antwerp and the activation of rail lines, finally allowed the logistical effort to breathe. Antwerp was a game-changer, a massive, deep-water port capable of handling the entire supply needs of the armies once it was fully secured and operational. The relentless, exhausting logistical sprint was giving way to a more sustainable strategic marathon. The final months of the Red Ball Express operation were spent consolidating, training, and preparing for the winter. The experience gained, the creation of forward ADSEC bases, the establishment of MP route control, and the mastery of high-volume, continuous throughput, became the template for future logistical operations. When the Red Ball was officially shut down, the system did not vanish. It simply dissolved into a more conventional, rail-supported supply chain. The lessons, however, were permanently written into the American logistical doctrine. The impact of the Red Ball Express can be seen most clearly through the lens of German operational planning. The strategic failure of the Wehrmacht was their inability to predict the Allied capacity for strategic mobility. They were masters of the tactical Blitz, concentrating force for a rapid, focused thrust. But they never achieved strategic mobility. The ability to sustain a high-speed advance over massive distances. The Americans, ironically, were the ones who truly achieved this, using trucks instead of horses and relying on overwhelming industrial output. When Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt was later questioned about the collapse of the German defenses in the West, he did not single out a single armored division or a brilliant Allied commander. He pointed to the American ability to keep moving. The sheer volume of men and material that poured into France, sustained by the logistical miracles like the Red Ball, utterly swamped the German capacity to resist. The Red Ball Express was the ultimate expression of American power. Not the power of the atomic bomb, not the power of the battleships, but the power of the Quartermaster Corps, the Ordnance Corps, and the Transportation Corps. The power of an economy capable of mass-producing the entire theater of war. It was the material proof that in the 20th century, logistics had transcended its historical supporting role and become the principal instrument of strategic coercion. The German generals, steeped in the tactics of Clausewitz and Moltke, had studied terrain, maneuver, and morale. They understood the physics of war. They failed to grasp the economics of war. They saw a shattered France and predicted a stalled enemy. They laughed at the logistical obstacles. But the drivers of the Red Ball Express, pushing their overloaded trucks through the darkness, delivered the definitive counterargument. They delivered the fuel and the steel that turned Patton's audacious gamble into inevitable victory. It was the sight of those endless rumbling columns, driven by men who were never meant to be frontline heroes, that finally shattered the German strategic imagination. They had prepared for an army that would fight by the rules of history, an army that would stop when it ran out of road. What they got was an army that simply invented a new, relentless road, running day and night, straight through their strategic assumptions. The Red Ball Express finished its work, not with a ceremonial parade, but with the quiet hum of trucks being turned over to newly operational railheads. It remains the legendary unsung testament to the fact that the velocity of war is always and forever dictated not by the ambition of the general, but by the dedication of the men who drive the trucks. They had been told to deliver the war to the enemy's doorstep, and they did it. They took the insult of underestimation, both from the enemy abroad and from the segregated command at home, and they transformed it into the fuel that drove the liberation of a continent. The laughter of the German generals had faded long ago, replaced by the deep, continuous rumble of the deuce and a halves, the sound of an unstoppable American industrial power accelerating toward Berlin. The logistical tale, once underestimated and ridiculed, had become the serpent's deadly strike.